The basic idea is conversion to evolution. In other words, I think I first got the idea when I was watching the David Attenborough series Life on Earth, which was sort of getting on for 30 years ago, I think now. What would happen, I thought, if marsupial animals actually evolved to the intelligence of humans? What would their lives be like? How would their society develop? And I started writing it from that point of view, but I've since changed it, and the introduction to it is basically through a human. Starts off as in the story, she's called Clara. She starts off as a 6-year-old girl who ends up actually living with them through a rather convoluted plot, which I'm hoping to try, and which I hope will be able to suspend disbelief and actually. I'll just read the little bits where she first meets the kangaroos. They live on an island in the middle of the very remote island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and her father is a ship owner. His men, having been blown slightly off course, land up in this island, and knowing that their master is interested in natural history as they think of it, capture some of the animals and bring them back to Western Australia where the family live. So I'll start off where her father has invited her to meet the new acquisition to his menagerie. We made our way to the larger cages where Papa kept his more dangerous animals, Tasmanian tigers, Tasmanian devils and dingoes, mostly sad, bored-looking creatures who lived out their days, pacing from one side of the cage to the other. As we walked, he asked me what I had been doing with Miss Fanshawe that morning. Sums, I replied, then asked him, Papa, why do I have to learn sums? Sums are very important. I have to do sums all the time. Do you, Papa? I was most impressed. Yes, I have to make sure my ship's turning a profit. Without that, you would have no nice house to live in, nor good food on the table, nor servants to look after you. Or Miss Fanshawe? A smile briefly crossed his face. Or Miss Fanshawe, there are advantages and disadvantages in every situation, Clara. All one can hope is that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Then he added more seriously, and my ship's officers have to do very complicated sums to work out where in the wide ocean their ship is located and make sure that she gets to where she needs to be. Without that, the ship would be lost, and every man aboard her. As I pondered the immense importance of sums, he stopped outside a large cage whose previous inmate had died some months earlier. Well, Clara, look what the captain of the Maria Marshall found when he was blown off course recently. I looked into the cage. Molly crouched down and growled. Papa spoke to her gently, and she stood beside him. Well, Clary Mary, what do you see? What do you think? At first I could only see a pile of straw. Then I stood on tiptoe and peered to the very back of the cage. There were 2 animals there, cowering together in the far corner. They looked frightened. Yes, and so would you, no doubt, if you were taken from your home, locked in the dark hold of a ship, and deposited in a cage in a strange place by people you had never met. But what do you think of their appearance? How do they look? They look like kangaroos. Do you notice any differences between them and other kangaroos? He lifted me up so that I could see more clearly. I looked carefully. Yes, they have long hair like people. Good. What else? And one of them, the one on the, I hastily reminded myself, I write with my right hand, so the left hand is left, and continued, and the one on the left has hair like a lion. Yes, very good. He does have a mane like a lion. I picked up on the he. So is he a boy kangaroo? Yes, you're right. Is the other one a girl kangaroo? Right again. What else do you notice? The girl has grey hair like an old lady, but the boy has the same browny hair as the rest of his body. Did not sound quite right, but Papa seemed to understand me. Is she older than him? Well done. Do you know how we could tell? From the hair? Well, that gave us a clue, but also her teeth are more worn than his. Are your teeth more worn than mine? Unfortunately, yes. I thought about this. Is she his mamma? It is possible, we can't be sure, we can hardly ask them. Why not? Well, they would not understand what we are saying. I thought of the animals in my storybook who spoke to each other in perfect English. Do they not speak English in their country? I very much doubt it. When I have learned French, I shall ask them. Clara, what other differences can you see between them and other kangaroos? I stared at them intently. They stared back with sullen curiosity. They have different shaped heads, more like people's heads. Good. And the mouth is different too. In what way? It does not stick out so much. Different shaped jaw. Excellent. He helped me again. Well done, Clara. You're a very clever girl with excellent powers of observation. I felt my cheeks turn red. Thank you, I whispered shyly. Papa, I added, do you think they're hungry? No, I don't think so. They have a pile of hay they have not even touched, except as bedding. Perhaps they do not like hay. May I give them some crusts? It cannot do any harm. I put a crust onto my flat palm, as I've been taught to do when feeding horses and sheep and untamed wallabies, and thrust it through the bars of the cage. No, don't do that! Papa pulled my arm back sharply, and the crust fell to the cage. The kangaroos looked in our direction, then at each other. Then a curious thing happened. They started talking to each other, not in English, of course, but in a mixture of coughs and barks and little yelps, looking at each other all the time. First the female made little noises, then the male, then the female again. Is that French? I asked Papa. He shook his head. Cautiously, the male kangaroo hopped towards the front of the cage, his eyes on us all the time. He was a fine-looking creature, easily as tall as any other kangaroo I had seen, with well-groomed fur and glistening hair. When he got within an arm's length of the front of the cage, he swooped down, snapped shut the crust in his hand, and leapt to the back of the cage, where he turned it in his hand and sniffed it. He handed it to the female kangaroo, who turned and sniffed it as well. Then she broke it in half and handed one half to the male, and each nibbled its half delicately. I threw another crust into the cage. This time the male picked it up with less hesitation, briefly sniffed it, and shared it with the female as she had done with the first crust. They are hungry, I said. Yes, strangely they did not eat the hay. Molly gave a low whine, sniffed at the newspaper, then stood up. She's taken some food to feed the animals and a bit of newspaper, then stood up on her hind legs to beg. I looked inside the parcel and noticed some scraps of ham. Pulling one out, I held it up for her. Wait, beg! She got up on her hind legs. Good girl, now girl, I called. And she jumped up and took the meat from my hand. Good girl, Molly. I petted her. The female kangaroo shuffled forward, sniffing the air as she advanced. She reached the front of the cage nearest to where I was standing, at the same time as I pulled out another piece of ham and held it out for Molly. Before Molly or I knew what was happening, a furry arm shot out, and the ham was snatched out of my hand. While Papa and I watched in astonishment, the female kangaroo leapt to the back of the cage, where she turned the scrap and sniffed it, as the male had done with the bread. Finally, she put it in her mouth, bit it in half, and handed one half to the male. They both chewed and swallowed quickly. I did not know that kangaroos ate ham, I said. Papa was staring in astonishment. Nor did I, Clara. I think you're right, they are hungry, and they do not like hay. How much more food do you have? I showed him. Not a lot. Empty it out on the floor of the cage. He helped me to do so, and we both stepped back, watching as both animals, with more confidence now, came forward, bent down, and began to pick up handfuls of scraps, shaking off any dirt clinging to them, and shuffle back to the back of the cage to eat them. Clara, did you notice their front paws? They're not paws, they're hands. You're right again, opposing thumbs like monkeys. To people. Yes, he said thoughtfully, like people. The next morning revealed Miss Fanshawe as good in health and bad in temper as ever, so my prayers or lack of them obviously made no difference. I was struggling to work out the cost in shillings and pence of 5 loaves of bread, 4p each, when there was a knock at the door. I kept my head down. Yes, Sarah? Please, Miss Fanshawe, the master asks whether Miss Clara might join him and Mr. Evans in the menagerie. Is that loud enough? Good. Mr. Evans, you say? Yes, certainly. Run along, Clara. I rose in delight and made for the door. It is a fine day, she added. I may join you myself in a while. I'm curious about these new kangaroos. Well, there's something to look forward to, eh, miss? Whispered Sarah as she closed the door on us. Mr. Evans was with one of Papa's friends. I liked him. He had a cheerful, smiling face and hair which flopped over his eyes, and he knew a lot about animals and got very excited about things. He reminded me of a puppy dog. Molly and I found him and Papa beside the kangaroo's cage. The kangaroos themselves were huddled miserably in the back, as on the previous day. Papa was speaking. And look at this, David. What do you make of it? He handed Mr. Evans what looked like a sharp knife, like the ones in Mrs. Halliday's kitchen that I was not allowed to go near. Mr. Evans turned it over in his hand, much as the kangaroos had turned over the crust of bread the previous day. Interesting design on the handle. It's not English, is it? No, Russell says it is Spanish, Toledo steel. But the important question is, what is a steel knife, Spanish or otherwise, doing in the possession of a kangaroo on an uncharted island in the middle of the Indian Ocean? You say in the possession? Was the animal actually using it as a knife? It had already stabbed Watkins in the arm and was going for the heart, which would probably have killed him if Russell had not got there first. Rum business. Most aggressive kangaroos I've ever met, and most intelligent. Right, so then there's the fetch game. Molly, having relaxed once Miss Fanshawe was gone, was getting impatient. She brought us a stick and we began to play the fetch game. Mr. Evans watched us. After a while he asked, if you throw it in the air, would you catch it before it hits the ground? I did not know, so he threw it to find out. Molly watched the stick fall to the ground before retrieving it and bringing it back. This went on for a few minutes until Mr. Evans suggested showing her what to do. He and I stood in front of the cage a couple of yards apart and threw the stick back and forth to each other. Molly watched her head moving from side to side as she followed the stick. Then she stood on her hind legs and begged. I threw the stick and she caught it in her mouth. Good girl! I patted her and gave her one of the crusts I had secreted away at breakfast. I threw the stick again. It had barely gone a couple of feet into the air when, to my astonishment, a hairy arm shot out of the cage and caught hold of the stick, then hastily withdrew into the cage. I looked round to see Mrs. Kangaroo holding the stick just the other side of the bars. She seemed to tease me, holding the stick out, then pulling it back when I reached for it. Mr. Kangaroo, who had been watching from the back, said something to her. She replied almost in annoyance and jerked her head to indicate that he should come forward. He hopped to join her at the front of the cage. After a few more exchanges between them, he crouched on his haunches and lifted up his hands in what looked like a mocking imitation of Molly's begging position. I took another crust and tossed it into the cage. He caught it in mid-air, as Mrs. Kangaroo had done the stick, and sniffed it and showed it to her. She said something to him and began to tease me with the stick again. Give her another crust, whispered Mr. Evans. I did so, and she caught it with her free hand, sniffed it, and returned the stick to me through the bars. We stared at the kangaroos in silence for several minutes after they had finished eating their crusts. 2 crusts for 1 stick. That must be the current rate of exchange, said Mr. Evans. I stared at him, then looked down, not understanding him and afraid to show my ignorance. It sounded like one of Mrs. Fanshawe's arithmetic problems. They are still hungry, I said at last. Mr. Evans was thoughtful. I think I know where we can find meat for them. Where, Mr. Evans? I could see he was about to say something, but changed his mind. Don't worry about it. I'll see to it. You run along. It must be almost time for your dinner. So, that's... And there's, obviously there's a lot more, but that's really her introduction to the kangaroos and how she realises that they can actually communicate with each other and they're very intelligent. So that's part of work in progress. So,